The state dining room was prepared. The guests had taken their places, and every detail had been approved, until a figure appeared at the entrance who was never meant to be there. Camilla's unexpected arrival did not merely surprise Princess Anne. It forced her to make an unprecedented decision in front of stunned officials. The entire state luncheon would be cancelled before a single formal toast could begin. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not raise her voice. She placed one hand on her chair, held Camilla's gaze, and quietly told the master of the household to dismiss every guest. The master of the household is the senior official responsible for managing royal events, staff, and ceremonial arrangements. That order mattered because the gathering at Windsor Castle had been planned for Commonwealth representatives, military leaders, and charitable delegates. 3 days earlier, the princess had approved every place at the table, knowing one mistake could embarrass the crown, before people representing service, sacrifice, and Britain's ties abroad. Camilla remained near the doorway as chairs moved and conversations died. Her confidence gave way to disbelief when she realized Anne would sacrifice the occasion rather than accept her uninvited presence. The Queen Consort's name had never appeared on the guest list because the event was under the princess's ceremonial control. A state luncheon is an official meal for important guests, and its host controls attendance, seating, and formal order. Anne had limited the room to representatives connected to the event. Camilla knew that boundary, yet she arrived expecting rank to overpower it. Charles watched the room empty and said nothing. The king's silence deepened the humiliation, because the vacant chair beside him was not an error. Anne had left it unclaimed as a sign that an unresolved family dispute would not enter a state occasion. She believed duty had to come before private pressure, even when that pressure came from her brother's wife. Camilla stepped forward and demanded to know whether the cancellation was truly because of her. Anne answered with a look that made the truth utterly unavoidable. The final guests disappeared beyond the doors, and Charles asked his sister to explain herself in private. Camilla refused to be excluded again. She insisted that every word be spoken before her, forcing the family toward the confrontation Anne had tried to prevent. The luncheon had been stopped, but the real confrontation was only beginning, because behind Anne's decision stood years of private resentment, divided loyalties, and one empty chair that meant far more than anyone in that room understood. To the departing guests, the cancelled luncheon looked like a sudden collapse of royal protocol. To Anne, Charles, and Camilla, it was something painfully personal. Each of them entered that room carrying a different version of duty, loyalty, and betrayal. What appeared to be a dispute over an invitation was really a collision between a sister protecting the crown, a king protecting his marriage, and a queen refusing to be excluded. Anne stayed beside the abandoned table after the last footsteps faded. Anger still held her rigid, but grief sat beneath it, heavier and harder to hide. She had spent decades building her reputation around discipline, punctuality, and service, so canceling a state engagement cut against everything she believed. A state engagement is an official royal duty carried out on behalf of the crown, meaning its collapse could embarrass invited guests and weaken trust in the institution. Yet she believed accepting Camilla's intrusion would cause even greater damage. Camilla stood several feet away, wounded and furious. She had expected resistance, perhaps even cold silence, but not complete rejection. The Queen Consort saw the cancellation as a deliberate humiliation, because every departing guest now understood that her presence had triggered it. She looked toward Charles for support, but the king remained caught between protecting his wife and defending the authority of the sister who had organized the gathering. Charles slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the untouched menu. His movement was calm, but strain entered his voice when he asked Anne whether she understood the damage she had caused. She answered without hesitation. The damage, she said, had begun before Camilla entered the room. That reply changed everything, because it revealed this was not a sudden act of anger. It was the final response to something already documented. Anne referred to a sealed briefing, delivered to her office 2 days earlier. A sealed briefing is a confidential written report shared only with authorized royal staff. The document showed that Camilla had attempted to alter the guest order without the organizers' approval, placing herself beside foreign representatives while pushing 2 military delegates farther down the table. Charles looked toward his wife, while she insisted the changes were meant to strengthen the occasion. Silence answered her. Anne knew the briefing explained the intrusion, but not the severity of her reaction. That came from an earlier remembrance reception, where a private warning had been ignored and a ceremonial boundary crossed before witnesses. To understand why Anne was willing to shatter royal protocol in front of the world, the story had to return to the evening when a quiet warning was ignored, and the family crossed its point of no return. The luncheon crisis did not begin at Windsor. Its true beginning came 6 weeks earlier, during a private remembrance reception at St. James's Palace. What should have been a solemn evening became the moment Anne's patience finally broke. One altered speech, one disputed seat, and one cold exchange in a corridor convinced her that Camilla was no longer merely testing royal boundaries. She was prepared to rewrite them. Anne had accepted responsibility for the reception because the evening honored long-serving military widows, women whose lives had been shaped by sacrifice and loss. Her bond with the armed forces made the duty personal, not ceremonial. A remembrance reception is a formal gathering created to honor service and preserve the memory of those who gave their lives. For the princess, that meant the guests had to remain at the center. No title, entrance, or royal rivalry could be allowed to overshadow them. Camilla had been invited to attend only the final part of the event. She was not scheduled to speak, and she had no place in the formal receiving line led by Anne. A receiving line is the ordered moment when senior hosts greet invited guests one by one. The arrangement had been approved in advance, yet minutes before the ceremony, the Queen Consort handed an aide a revised program, naming herself as the principal speaker and moving Anne's tribute to the end. Anne discovered the change outside the ballroom, while holding the original program. Her expression hardened, but she did not create a scene. She led Camilla into a side corridor and asked why the schedule had been rewritten without permission. The Queen Consort answered that her senior rank justified the change. The princess replied that remembrance was not a stage on which rank should be displayed, and the women inside had not come to witness a struggle for position. Camilla refused to withdraw the new program until Anne ordered the aide to restore the original version. The ceremony continued, but the damage remained. Later that evening, Charles asked his sister to overlook the incident for the sake of family unity. The king described it as a misunderstanding. She heard something else, a conscious challenge being softened, because confronting his wife felt more painful than disappointing his sister. Anne responded by ordering a documented review of every upcoming event under her authority. The written findings revealed similar requests involving seating plans, speaking precedents, and introductions. Each request pushed Camilla closer to roles she had not been assigned. The state luncheon therefore became a test. She would either respect the boundary already delivered or prove before witnesses that nothing had changed. When Camilla walked into the Windsor dining room without an invitation, Anne did not see a surprise guest. She saw the final confirmation of a warning she had already delivered, and Charles had chosen not to enforce. Once the guests had departed, the great doors closed, leaving Anne and Camilla only a few feet apart. There were no applauding crowds, no carefully prepared statements, and no ceremonial smiles to hide behind. The silence became more brutal than shouting. Camilla demanded to know who had given Anne the authority to exclude her. Anne's answer landed with the force of a royal judgment. The responsibility had been hers from the beginning. Charles ordered the remaining attendants to leave before another word was spoken. He believed privacy might contain the damage, because a palace scandal grows the moment staff begin carrying fragments of an argument through separate corridors. The king also knew his sister had been appointed host of the luncheon, meaning she held direct responsibility for its diplomatic guests, ceremonial order, and approved seating. Anne had accepted that duty personally, and she would not allow it to be reduced to a suggestion. Camilla moved toward the empty place beside Charles and pulled the chair away from the table. Anne stepped forward, placed one hand against its back, and pushed it beneath the table again, with calm, deliberate force. The queen consort accused her of trying to erase her position. The princess answered that no title gave anyone the right to enter a state event uninvited, and force every other person to adjust. Charles felt the argument slipping beyond control. He asked Anne to apologize, hoping one sentence might end the humiliation before it became a lasting family wound. She refused. An apology, she said, would make the boundary appear accidental, when it had been clearly stated in writing. The monarch looked toward his wife, expecting her to deny knowing the arrangement. Instead, Camilla's face hardened. Camilla admitted she had seen the final guest list. She knew her name was missing, and she had still arrived because she believed no member of staff would dare turn away the king's wife. The confession changed the room. What had looked like confusion was now revealed as intention, and what she considered confidence sounded to Anne like a direct use of Charles's position to defeat another royal's authority. Charles did not answer immediately. The king stared at the chair she had tried to claim, then at the sister who had defended the rules he was supposed to uphold. His expression shifted from frustration to something colder. For the first time, the question was no longer whether Anne had overreacted. It was whether Camilla had knowingly placed him above the very boundaries that gave the monarchy order. Anne had forced the truth into the open, but the person who now had to decide its consequences was Charles, and his choice would reveal whether the crown still controlled the household, or whether personal loyalty controlled the crown. The most powerful person in the room suddenly appeared to have the fewest choices. Charles stood between his sister and his wife, knowing that any decision would wound someone he loved. Defending Camilla could weaken Anne's authority and reward a deliberate breach. Supporting Anne would humiliate the woman he had spent decades protecting. The cancelled luncheon had become a test not of ceremony, but of whether the king could separate marriage from monarchy. Charles reached for the printed guest list and read it once, then again. Camilla's name was absent both times. As sovereign, he held the final authority to reverse the cancellation, restore the gathering, or formally reprimand either woman. The sovereign is the reigning monarch who carries the crown's highest constitutional and ceremonial authority. Yet power did not make the choice easier. Every option carried a cost that would follow him far beyond the empty room. Anne watched her brothers struggle, but she did not soften. Her authority did not come from rank alone. It came from decades of service, and from the trust of military leaders, diplomats, and charities that saw her as one of the monarchy's most dependable figures. If Charles overruled her now, he would not simply defend his wife. He would tell everyone working under royal authority that written instructions could be ignored whenever personal influence became strong enough. Camilla broke the silence first. She asked the king to order the staff back into the room and continue the luncheon as planned. The queen consort argued that restarting it would prevent further embarrassment. Anne answered that it would do the opposite. Restoring the event after a deliberate intrusion would turn a private breach into an official endorsement, proving that the rules applied only until someone close to the monarch decided otherwise. Charles set the paper down and looked toward his sister. He told her she had placed him in an impossible position. The princess replied that the position had become impossible when his written instructions stopped carrying consequences. Her words cut deeper than anger, because they exposed a weakness he had tried not to name. The private secretary entered only after being summoned and confirmed the final detail through a documented morning briefing. Camilla's office had been reminded that she was not attending. Her arrival had been planned with full knowledge of the restriction. Charles finally refused to restart the luncheon. He ordered the cancellation to remain in effect, and the decision moved through the palace before the table had even been cleared. By refusing to overrule Anne, Charles had made his first choice, but behind closed doors, Camilla was about to discover that the lost luncheon was only the beginning of her new reality. There was no dramatic announcement and no public decree, yet the consequences moved through the palace with ruthless speed. Invitations were reviewed, staff were instructed, future appearances were questioned. Camilla returned to her private rooms, expecting Charles to soften what had happened. Instead, she found a revised schedule waiting on the table, one that removed her from 2 events connected to Anne and placed every remaining appearance under tighter approval. Camilla read the first page without moving, then stopped at the line, removing her from an upcoming veterans reception. She folded the schedule slowly and placed it face down. The veterans reception was an official gathering created to honor former members of the armed forces, making her removal especially painful because it publicly reduced her role in an area closely linked to royal service. The cancelled luncheon had already embarrassed the household. Now the consequences threatened her place in future duties. Palace staff moved quickly because the damage reached far beyond one dining room. Diplomats needed explanations. Military representatives required formal apologies. Caterers had to be dismissed, and security teams had to rewrite departure plans. A private family conflict had become an operational crisis, involving every office connected to the event. Staff were also told that guest lists approved under Anne's authority were final and could not be changed through informal pressure from another royal household. Camilla felt abandoned by the man she expected to defend her. Charles had allowed his sister's decision to stand immediately after hearing the admission that she had knowingly ignored the guest list. That timing made the humiliation sharper. When the king entered, she asked whether his silence in the dining room had been intended as punishment. He answered that silence had been the only way to stop the situation from becoming even more destructive. Charles then revealed what senior aides had recorded in 3 separate documented accounts. Camilla's office had previously attempted to bypass event hosts by changing speaking orders, requesting different seats, and seeking introductions that had never been approved. The king explained that the luncheon could no longer be dismissed as one moment of poor judgment. It had become part of a pattern, and the pattern had now been seen by too many people to ignore. Camilla asked whether Anne had been collecting evidence against her. Charles said no. His sister had simply begun demanding written records after the remembrance reception, because verbal boundaries had repeatedly failed. Then he delivered the detail that changed the mood again. Anne had requested a private meeting with him that evening, without advisors and without Camilla. The cancelled luncheon had stripped away the protection of ceremony, and when brother and sister finally met alone, they would have to speak not as senior royals, but as 2 members of a family facing a painful truth. That evening, Charles and Anne met in a small private sitting room with no aides, no documents, and no ceremonial titles between them. The confrontation had passed, but its emotional cost remained. Anne did not ask her brother to choose between 2 women. She asked him to remember the difference between protecting someone from cruelty and protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. Charles listened without interruption. He and his sister had survived decades of family crisis together, and her blunt honesty had often reached him when softer voices could not. Their meeting remained private because both understood that secretaries, schedules, and competing households could only manage the damage. They could not repair the trust beneath it. For once, the king had to answer not as sovereign, but as a brother who knew the truth had been delayed too long. Charles finally admitted that he had known Camilla sometimes pushed beyond agreed boundaries. He had seen small changes, informal requests, and moments when she expected others to adjust rather than challenge her. Yet he had avoided confronting the pattern because he feared reopening the rejection and isolation she had carried for years. The monarch believed protection would preserve peace. Instead, his silence had taught everyone that the rules weakened whenever pain became involved. Anne felt her anger soften into sadness. She told him that protecting a marriage should never require everyone else to surrender their responsibilities. The princess had not cancelled the luncheon to punish his wife. She had done it because written limits had become meaningless, and because every ignored boundary made the next challenge more likely. Charles asked whether the cancellation had truly been necessary. Anne answered that nothing weaker would have proved the rule still mattered. A state engagement is an official royal duty carried out on behalf of the crown, so the person appointed to host it must be able to control attendance, seating, and ceremonial roles. Without that authority, responsibility becomes empty because the host carries the blame while someone else holds the power. Charles made his decision. For every future state engagement, the appointed host would have final authority, regardless of rank. No household could rewrite the guest list through private pressure. No title could force an unapproved place at the table. Anne asked him to tell Camilla himself. The king nodded, knowing the decision would become visible even without a formal announcement. The family had reached its private decision, but the empty dining room could not remain hidden, and by sunrise one photograph would transform a palace dispute into a national judgment. By morning, the cancelled luncheon no longer belonged to the palace. A photograph of the untouched dining table appeared across Britain: polished glasses, folded napkins, abandoned place cards, and one chair beside the king with no name before it. The image said what no official statement dared to say. Something serious had happened inside Windsor Castle, and the public immediately understood that the empty chair stood at the center of it. The palace tried to contain the damage with a brief statement describing the cancellation as an unexpected internal scheduling matter. The phrase sounded careful, but it failed because the event had involved diplomats, military representatives, and charitable delegates whose departures had already been noticed. An official palace statement is a short public explanation issued on behalf of the royal household. This one offered no answer for why Anne, known for discipline and reliability, would abandon a major duty over something minor. Broadcasters turned quickly to her record. Commentators reminded viewers that the princess had spent decades completing engagements under pressure, rarely allowing personal discomfort to interfere with service. That history gave the cancellation weight. Supporters believed she would not have cleared the room unless a serious boundary had been crossed. Critics answered that invited guests had paid the price for a family dispute, and that national dignity should never be used as leverage inside a private conflict. The story exploded when the Crown Chronicle placed the untouched table across its front page, beneath the headline, "Anne clears the room." A printed timeline traced Camilla's uninvited arrival, the sudden dismissal of guests, and Charles's refusal to restart the luncheon. Beside it, the empty chair became a symbol stronger than any quote. It represented authority challenged, duty interrupted, and a family argument no longer hidden behind palace doors. Outside Windsor Castle, a retired army nurse lifted a handwritten sign reading, "Duty needs boundaries." A small crowd applauded as Anne's car passed through the gate, while others stood silently, troubled by the public humiliation surrounding Camilla. The reaction was divided, but the image had already fixed the emotional meaning of the crisis in the nation's mind. Palace correspondents then confirmed, through a documented briefing, that Charles had upheld the cancellation and approved a new event protocol. The decision proved that Anne's authority had prevailed over Camilla's expectation. The nation had already formed its verdict. But the monarchy's true resolution would depend on what happened when Camilla faced the empty place she had tried to claim, and accepted why it would remain unavailable. The crisis ended not with another confrontation, but with an act of surrender so quiet that only those closest to the family understood its meaning. Days later, Camilla received an invitation to a smaller royal engagement hosted by Anne. Her name appeared clearly on the list, her role was precisely defined, and no seat beside Charles had been promised. This time, she followed the arrangement exactly, and the monarchy finally exhaled. Charles formally approved the new hosting protocol before any further event could proceed. The protocol was a clear set of palace rules, giving each appointed host final control over the guest list, order of precedence, and speaking roles. Order of precedence means the formal ranking that determines where royals sit, stand, and appear during official duties. The king understood why this mattered. Responsibility could not remain credible if another household could quietly overturn every decision. Anne then rescheduled the abandoned luncheon under her own leadership. She ensured that the original Commonwealth representatives, military leaders, and charitable delegates received personal apologies and renewed invitations. The princess knew their trust had been damaged because they had arrived expecting respect and left carrying the discomfort of a family conflict. Restoring the event was therefore not about saving appearances. It was about honoring the people who should never have been drawn into the dispute. Camilla entered the rescheduled engagement only after a member of staff checked her name against the approved list. She paused beside Anne, acknowledged the seating arrangement, and quietly said she understood it. The queen consort did not ask for another chair or a different role. That restraint cost her pride, but it also ended the cycle of intrusion, resistance, and public embarrassment. Anne did not smile in victory, or use the moment to humiliate her. She simply nodded and continued greeting the guests. Her response proved that revenge had never been the goal. The boundary had been restored, and once it was respected, the princess had no need to punish anyone further. Charles felt the weight of the lesson more deeply than either woman knew. The monarch had learned that love could not protect someone from every consequence without weakening everyone else's duty. By supporting the new rule, he preserved his marriage through honesty and defended the crown through fairness. The empty chair was eventually filled, the guests returned, and the luncheon finally proceeded. But the monarchy that gathered around that table was different, quieter, more disciplined, and certain that even within a royal family, duty must always have the final word. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.